The solicitor arrived at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the frost had not yet lifted from the churchyard grass, and the drawing-room fire at Ashton Grange had not yet been laid. Dorothea Crane stood at the window when the black carriage stopped on the drive, watching the dark-coated figure descend with the particular briskness of a man who has unpleasant business to conduct and wishes to conduct it quickly. She had been expecting something. She had been expecting it for 11 months, in one form or another, arriving at various doors in various envelopes sealed with various seals. She had not been expecting a carriage with the Ashford crest on its door, and she was not entirely prepared for what the crest implied. His name was Mr. Partridge, and he represented the interests of the Marquis of Ashford, Viscount Hadley, Lord of the Westerby Estates, a name that arrived with the weight of 3 titles and a solicitor's careful pronunciation of each one. Mr. Partridge carried a leather satchel and a very thin smile. He was offered tea and declined it. He was offered the good chair by the hearth and sat in it as though he had not waited for the invitation. He laid his satchel across his knees and folded his hands on top of it with the precision of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts in rooms that could not argue back. "Miss Crane," he said, "the matter concerns your late father's arrangement with the Westerby trustees." Dorothea did not sit down. She had learned, in the 11 months since her father's death, that the world treated seated women as obstacles to be managed and standing women as problems to be addressed, and she preferred to be a problem. She was 23 years old, the sole surviving child of a man who had spent his last decade borrowing against an estate that was never fully his to borrow against, and she had the particular composure of someone who has already absorbed the worst and is now simply waiting to discover its precise dimensions. What Mr. Partridge laid out for her, in careful sequential sentences that he clearly found no pleasure in, was straightforward. Her father had owed the Westerby estate £1,140 at the time of his death, secured against the tenancy of Ashton Grange, and the Marquis of Ashford had acquired that debt through the recent consolidation of the Westerby Trust. The debt was now due. The Marquis had, in his considerable generosity, authorized Mr. Partridge to convey to Miss Crane the following proposal. She was to vacate the Grange by the close of the month, the furniture and household goods to be surrendered in partial satisfaction of the outstanding sum, and she was to receive in exchange the sum of £100, enough to see her to a respectable lodging for some months, provided she signed a document attesting that she had no further claims on the Westerby estate or its principal, and would raise none. £100. For 11 months of her life managing this house alone. For her father's garden, still producing the kitchen vegetables that kept the household through October. For the music room where her mother had played every evening until the year she died, the piano still in its corner with the same candles in the sconces. £100, and her silence on the matter. The Marquis has authorized this arrangement. Mr. Partridge said, his voice carrying the smooth inevitability of a man repeating a legal formula he has used many times, as a private act of generosity to a party in reduced circumstances. He opened the satchel and produced a single folded document, setting it on the table between them with a careful hand. "The terms are favorable, Miss Crane. I would encourage you not to hesitate." She looked at the document. She looked at the man. She looked at the fire she had not yet had laid that morning, and at the frost still white on the churchyard grass beyond the window, and at the carriage on the drive with the Ashford crest on its door, and she made a decision she could not yet fully name, but could feel settling into her spine like cold water finding its level. "I will not sign," she said, without first speaking to the Marquis himself. "Mr. Partridge's thin smile thinned further. "His lordship does not conduct personal negotiations on matters of debt settlement. That is precisely the function of a solicitor, to conduct." I understand what he conducts and what he does not, Dorothea said, with no change of expression. I am asking for his name on paper. Not a solicitor's signature. Not a trustee's seal. His name, on whatever document I sign, so that I know precisely who I am releasing from obligation and who is releasing me. She set her hands together in front of her, very still. If the arrangement is, as you say, generous, then the Marquis will have no particular objection to being identified as the source of that generosity. If he does have an objection, I would like to understand its nature before I sign anything at all. Mr. Partridge left without his signature. He left the document behind on the table, as though its presence overnight might weigh upon her and change her mind by morning. It did not change her mind. If you have stayed with a decision through a long night when everything practical argues against it, you will understand something of how Dorothea spent that week. She spent it in the Grange, reviewing the accounts she knew by heart, walking the kitchen garden in the frost, listening to the house settle in the cold. She had asked for a reasonable thing. She knew it was a reasonable thing. She had become, in 11 months of managing alone, very certain about the difference between what was reasonable and what the world would call reasonable on her behalf. The Marquis of Ashford received his solicitor's report 3 days later at his London townhouse, and read it twice. That a woman with no legal recourse, no male guardian, no surviving fortune, and no evident prospects had declined an offer of £100 because she wanted his name on paper, struck him, at first reading, as either obstinacy or a misunderstanding of her own position. He read it a third time and concluded it was neither. He sent word that she was to be received at the offices of Partridge and Holt the following Thursday at 11 o'clock. The interview was arranged accordingly, and Dorothea arrived in a gown she had turned twice already, with gloves she had mended at the left thumb, and the composure of someone who has spent 3 days preparing for a conversation that might end her none the less. She was shown to a small anteroom with 2 chairs and a window overlooking the street. She waited 11 minutes, and then the door opened and Edmund Carver, Marquis of Ashford, came into the room, and he was nothing like what she had assembled in her mind during the 11-minute wait. She had assembled someone cold, correct, aristocratic in the particular way that makes a room feel smaller and its occupants feel assessed. What arrived was a man who moved as though he had recently been required to learn stillness and had not yet made it entirely habitual, a tension in the shoulders under the dark coat, a careful placing of himself in the chair across from her, eyes that moved quickly over the room, and then settled on her, and did not move again. He was not what the room expected a marquis to be. She was quite certain, looking at him, that he was entirely aware of it. "Miss Crane," he said. His voice was level and dry. "You declined the arrangement." "I asked for a clarification," she said. "Your solicitor characterized it as a declination. They are different things, and I suspect you already know that, or you would have sent Mr. Partridge back rather than coming yourself." A pause. Not the pause of a man composing himself, but of a man unexpectedly attending to something he had not quite predicted. "What clarification do you require?" "I require your name on whatever I sign," she said. "I require to know, formally and in writing, that the Marquis of Ashford himself has reviewed and authorized the specific terms of the agreement by which I surrender my father's home. Not a trustee, not a solicitor. You." She held his gaze with complete steadiness. "If the arrangement is generous, as stated, then you will have no difficulty being identified as its origin. If you do have a difficulty, I would like to understand it." The Marquis looked at her for a long moment. He had large hands, she noticed, which he had placed flat on the table between them, with a deliberateness that suggested some thought had gone into the placement. His jaw held a slight tension at the corner that she read, correctly, as something other than irritation, closer to the expression of a man confronting a problem he had not correctly mapped. "That is a reasonable request," he said. It was not what Mr. Partridge had said. It was not, she suspected, what anyone in his position had said to her in 11 months of managing alone. She felt something loosen very slightly in the region of her sternum, which she did not permit to reach her face. "Then we are agreed," she said. "We are not agreed yet," he said, with the same level voice. "We have established that your request is reasonable. The terms themselves remain open." She had not expected that. She had expected to fight for the acknowledgement and receive it grudgingly. She had not expected him to suggest that the terms themselves might be renegotiated. She adjusted her understanding of the room and the man in it, the way one adjusts one's footing on ice when it holds. "What would you propose?" she said. What he proposed, over the course of an hour during which Mr. Partridge sat in the corner with the expression of a man watching an event he had not anticipated and could not stop, was not what she had anticipated. He had read the account books. He had read them himself, her father's account books, which apparently had accompanied the transfer of the debt as part of the trust's standard documentation. And he had found in them a record that his own steward had overlooked when the debt was acquired, a sum of £320 paid to the Westerby estate directly in quarterly installments over a period of 6 years. The installments had stopped 8 years ago at the death of her father's business partner, whose share of the arrangement had then been incorrectly classified at that time as a charitable contribution rather than a debt service payment. They had never been credited against the principal. The error had persisted through 3 transitions of trust administration. £320, correctly credited, reduced the outstanding debt to £820. £820, set against the value of the household furnishings, the livestock, the standing timber on the north field, which Mr. Partridge's original assessment had substantially undervalued, produced a figure that was, the Marquess said, in the same level voice with which he discussed everything, close enough to settled that the estate would accept it as settled. She could remain at Ashton Grange. She sat very still for a moment, in which she did not entirely trust the room's steadiness. "You found this?" she said carefully. "In the account books." "My steward did not," he said. "I read them myself afterward." He did not say after what. He did not need to. She looked at his hands on the table. She looked at the careful placing of them. She thought about a man who had inherited, at 27, a title, a consolidation of multiple estates, and a cascade of other people's debts, and who had read the account books himself in the evenings, presumably by candlelight, and had found a line item that exonerated a woman he had never met and had no obligation to exonerate. If she had not asked for his name on paper, she would never have been in this room. She would have signed and been grateful and gone, and he would have let her go, and the error would have continued to belong to the file. "Why?" she said. "Did you not send this information in the original communication from your solicitor?" The tension in his jaw shifted slightly. "I was not aware of it at the time of the original communication," he said. "I became aware of it afterward, when I read the file more carefully." "And you arranged the interview rather than simply sending the corrected terms by letter?" "Yes." She did not press further. She understood, with a clarity she was careful not to show, that he had wanted to see the woman who had asked for his name on paper. She was not certain. Sitting across a table from him in a solicitor's anteroom in Cheapside. What to do with that understanding? She thanked him in the correct forms. She left the building with the document unsigned and a new arrangement pending further correspondence, and she rode home to Ashton Grange in the hired carriage with the frost on the fields and the October light going early. And she thought about his hands on the table and the deliberate placing of them. She thought about him for 4 days, without meaning to. If you have felt something like that particular attention, a face returning in the morning when you had not invited it, a voice speaking in your recall with more precision than a single interview warrants, then you will know what those 4 days were like for Dorothea Crane, sitting at the window of a house that was still, now, hers. He called on the 5th day. Not the solicitor. Him, in a plain carriage without the Ashford crest, arriving at 10:30 on a Monday morning when the frost was already beginning to lift. He stood at the door of Ashton Grange in a dark wool coat and asked, in the voice that was level. Even when it was asking something, it had no clear practical reason to ask, whether the household was settled for the winter, given the question of the Northfield timber and the matter of the eastern hedgerow. He had had his steward note on the original property assessment. She stood in her own doorway in a silence that lasted a breath too long. The Northfield is managed well enough, she said. I have my steward's report that the northern hedgerow has a gap broad enough to let the cattle through to the lane, he said. It should be addressed before the hard frost sets in. I can send a man this week. You need not send a man, she said. I have men enough. I know you have men, he said. I am offering regardless. It was a command dressed as an offer, offered in a tone of complete calm, and she accepted it in the way one accepts something unfamiliar when it arrives without pressure, and one's own pulse is behaving in a manner one finds inconvenient. He sent the man. He did not come himself that week. She was relieved. And she was also, in a way she examined directly, and then looked away from, not entirely relieved. It was Mrs. Totten who said it first. Mrs. Totten delivered most things of consequence from the kitchen doorway, with her hands wrapped in her apron and her eyebrows offering independent editorial assessment of everything her voice remained carefully neutral about. She said it on a Thursday evening while Dorothea was working through the winter accounts at the kitchen table, which was where the accounts were always reviewed when the drawing-room fire had not been laid, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house. He is not the sort to send a man for a hedgerow, Mrs. Totten said, without looking up from the pastry she was rolling. Not a man who reads the account books himself. Dorothea did not answer. Mrs. Fallow at the Hadley Arms has a cousin who keeps house at Westerby Park. Mrs. Totten continued, in the same mild tone. She says the Marquis has not called on a woman socially in 3 years. Not since Lady Carver died. 2 winters past. A pause in the rolling. He sent a man for your hedgerow. He has an obligation arising from the debt settlement, Dorothea said. The property was assessed as part of the trust's accounting. The debt is settled, Mrs. Totten said. The obligation is resolved. There is nothing left that requires a man for a hedgerow. Dorothea said nothing further. She returned to the accounts. Mrs. Totten's eyebrows communicated several additional observations that her voice declined to make. The second time the label was spoken aloud, it was not kind, and it was not quiet, and the voice that spoke it was Lady Sefton's, which was a voice that had never in its life encountered a social calculation it was willing to keep to itself. Lady Sefton was a cousin of Lady Carver's family. That network of connections which had formed its own opinion of the Marquis's widowhood and what ought to be done about it. And she was visiting the Hadley Arms for the late-season shooting when she encountered Dorothea in the village on a Thursday morning in November. The encounter happened in front of the draper's shop, in cold, full daylight, in front of Mrs. Burrow, and the solicitor's wife and 2 young women, who were just coming out of the milliner's and had the misfortune of good hearing. The girl, Lady Sefton said to her companion, at a volume that made the pretense of privacy a courtesy she was not extending, who demanded the Marquis put his own name to his solicitor's work. A debtor's daughter, from a letting farm, playing at consequence with a peer of the realm. She turned to her companion with a smile shaped like sympathy. One feels for her circumstances. Genuinely. There are rules. There have always been rules. And a woman in her position, who does not understand them, is not to be helped by pretending they do not exist. Dorothea stood on the pavement 2 feet from the draper's door, with the cold morning air in her lungs, and the weight of Lady Sefton's certainty descending across her shoulders like a garment belonging to someone else. She felt the hot crawl of shame that she had spent 11 months teaching herself to outrun, and she had not, apparently, outrun it entirely. She stood very still. She purchased her thread. She selected it slowly, holding the card up to the light in the draper's doorway, as though the quality of the color required this attention. And she did not hurry because she would not be seen to hurry. She thanked Mrs. Burrow, who had said nothing but whose face had done something small and uncomfortable, and she exchanged pleasantries with the draper about the weather and the quality of the new merino that had come in from London. And only when she had done all of this correctly did she walk out into the cold and turn toward home. The road back to Ashton Grange was 1.25 miles of frozen track between stone walls, and she walked it with her hands in her gloves and her chin level and the thread in her basket and the cold air sharp in her chest. She had learned, in the 11 months since her father died, that the world offered 2 strategies to a woman in her position. She could be visibly wounded, which produced a particular kind of social pity that was worse than the wound. Or she could be visibly composed, which produced a different kind of condescension, but left her dignity intact. She had chosen the second, and had not regretted it. She did not regret it now. She walked home through the frost and reminded herself, with the precision of someone who has made the argument many times before, that Lady Sefton's social arithmetic was not the same as the truth of things, but she thought about the rules. She thought about them the way one thinks about a wall one has been instructed not to examine, which is to say persistently and with considerable attention. Edmund Carver was thinking about the rules as well, though not in the way Lady Sefton would have recognized. He had inherited, along with his title and his estates, his late wife's family's architecture of expectation, the understanding that a Marquis of Ashford's public conduct was social currency, and that it was not to be spent carelessly, particularly not on women in reduced circumstances whose fathers had owed money to the trust he administered. He was aware of this architecture. He was aware, as he had been aware of a great many things that autumn, that the architecture was real, and that his awareness of it was not the same as his agreement with it. What he could not stop thinking about, at his desk in the evenings, with the account books he had now begun to review personally rather than delegating, was the particular quality of her stillness in that anteroom in Cheapside. He had met, in 7 years as Marquis, very few people who held their ground without visible desperation, who asked for what was reasonable without aggression or apology, who looked at a man who could settle their situation with a signature, and said calmly that a reasonable request and a declination were different things. He had met almost none who did it without apparent awareness that they were doing anything at all out of the ordinary. His wife had been different in nearly every respect. Clara had been quick and warm and socially adept in ways he was not, and he had failed her in ways he had spent 2 years cataloging with the care one devotes to things that cannot be undone. She had been ill for 8 months before she died, and he had spent 6 of those months managing the estate at a distance because the estate had required it, telling himself that the steward's reports were sufficient, that the letters were adequate, that she would understand. She had understood. That had been, in the end, the specific nature of his failure. She had understood too well, and had said so only once, in a letter he kept in the top drawer of the desk at Westerby Park. In a sentence he had read so many times the paper had softened at the fold. He had not opened that drawer in 4 months. He had once, and that was enough. He had not, in the 2 years since, been particularly interested in the question of whether he might feel differently for someone else. The question had seemed, in the accounting of his days, beside the point. He was not beside the point now. He called again 3 weeks after the hedgerow. He came himself this time, without a pretext he fully believed in, and sat in the drawing room where Dorothea had had a fire laid because she had known, somehow, that he might come. He accepted the tea. They spoke for 40 minutes about the standing timber on the north field, and the question of the eastern wall of the Westerby estate's old granary, and whether the parish road needed resurfacing before spring. And the whole time, under all of it, there was a current between them that neither of them named, but that both of them could feel. The way a room feels charged before lightning, without either person present having to say so. "You are managing well," he said, as he stood to leave. "I am managing," she said. "Well is an aspiration, rather than a settled state." She paused. "I did not expect to be doing it from inside my own house." He looked at her. "I would not have let it end otherwise," he said, "once I understood the account books." "I know," she said. And then, because she could feel the conversation at a threshold and did not know which of them was going to step over it first, she said, "You came yourself. You could have sent the corrected terms by letter." "Yes," he said. She waited. "I wanted to see for myself," he said, with the directness that she had come to understand was not bluntness, but rather the absence of performance. Whether the woman in the account file was the woman in the room. Whether they were the same person. And are they? He looked at her for a long moment with the careful expression that was, she had learned, his version of an open one. "They are more than I expected of either," he said, and left before she could answer. She stood in the warm drawing room for a long time after the carriage was gone, with her hands at her sides, understanding something she had not been prepared for, and that she was not, she realized, attempting to argue herself out of. Mrs. Totten appeared in the doorway. "Say nothing," Dorothea said. "I have said nothing," said Mrs. Totten, and withdrew, though her expression in withdrawing said several additional things. The question arrived 10 days later, not as a letter, but as an evening visit. And it was not, in the end, a question about the estate. It was late for a call, the frost thick on the drive, and Edmund Carver came in and did not sit down and stood in the drawing room in his dark coat and looked at her for a moment with an expression that had, finally, let go of its careful management and become simply what it was. She had seen it happening, piece by piece, over 5 weeks. She had seen it and had not permitted herself to name it. In the way one does not name a thing one is not yet certain one is permitted to want. "There is something I want to say to you," he said. "I am not entirely certain I have the right to say it." "Then say it, and let me judge the right," she said. He said it. He said it in the way he said everything that mattered to him, plainly, without the theatrical architecture that the situation might have invited. He told her that he had come to the account books in the first place with the ordinary professional interest of a trustee reviewing an acquisition, and that what had stopped him from simply delegating the resolution was a letter in the file, one of her father's letters to the original Westerby steward, written 6 years ago when the quarterly payments were first in arrears, which was so careful and so clear and so entirely free of self-pity that he had read it 3 times before he understood what was stopping him. He said that the interview in Cheapside had confirmed what the letter had suggested, and then produced something the letter had not warned him about. He said that the 5 weeks since had made him unsteady in a way he had not expected, and had not been for 3 years, and had not, he said, been planning on. He stopped and looked at his hands, which were at his sides this time rather than on the table. "I am aware that my position relative to yours makes this complicated," he said. "I would not want you to feel that I am putting any pressure on the situation. If this is unwelcome, I would not wish to presume." "You are not putting pressure on anything," she said. "I know the difference between pressure and a declaration." She held his gaze. "I am not uncomfortable with what you are saying. I am attending to it." Something shifted in his face that had nothing performed about it. He crossed the room. He took her hand, not the gloved one, the right hand that she had been holding slightly away from her side without knowing it. And he held it with the gravity of a man who understands that the thing he is holding is not merely a hand, and her pulse behaved in a way that was not inconvenient so much as entirely present. "Then attend to this as well," he said quietly. "I would like to come tomorrow and speak to you properly." "Come then," she said. He came in the morning, in the plain carriage, and he was shown into the drawing room where the fire had been burning well for an hour, and the tea things were already laid, because Mrs. Totten had laid them an hour before the appointed time, with an expression of careful neutrality that communicated everything. He sat in the chair across from Dorothea in his dark coat, with his hat on the side table and his hands on his knees, and the room had the quality of a room in which something is about to be said. The particular held-breath quality of winter mornings when the light is very clean and the cold outside makes the warmth inside meaningful. He asked, in his level, unhurried voice, whether she would consent to become the Marchioness of Ashford. He did not add flourishes. He did not add conditions or qualifications or the elaborate legal scaffolding that the solicitor's world might have produced around such a proposal. He added only that he was asking her because he wished to, which was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in 11 months, and which arrived, for that reason, with the weight of something long overdue. She did not say yes immediately. She sat with the weight of it for a moment, the genuine full weight of being offered a thing she had not, in her most careful private accounting of the future, allowed herself to plan for. She looked at the fire. She looked at the drawing room. She looked at the man across from her, with his hands on his knees, and his face doing what it had learned to do in the past weeks, which was to wait, and to let her see that it was waiting, without hurry and without pressure. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, once, barely audible. She thought, later, that it might have been the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. The engagement was not long, and the announcement was made through the proper channels that same week, and Lady Sefton received it at the Hadley Arms over a late breakfast with the expression of a woman who has issued a verdict and watched it go unremarked. The third time the label was spoken aloud was at the Hadley Assembly in December, where Lady Sefton said, to a circle that included Mrs. Burrow and the Reverend Calthwaite and his wife and several other persons of the neighborhood standing near the card-room door, that the Marquis's attachment to the debt girl of Ashton Grange was a thing most unfortunate, and that a man of his rank was surely suffering some temporary confusion about his station and his obligations. The word carried, as it was meant to carry. Edmund was across the card-room when she heard it. He had come with her, publicly, to the assembly for the first time, a fact understood by everyone present, and remarked upon by no one except Lady Sefton. He was in conversation with the Reverend about the parish road. She knew by now that his attention was never entirely where it appeared to be, and she watched his conversation pause and resume, and then, without visible hurry, conclude. He crossed the room. Not in the manner of a man performing a crossing. Without theater. Without haste. Without any of the ballroom grandeur that the scene might have permitted him. He simply walked to her, as though that was the only natural direction the room contained, and he stopped beside her at the threshold between the card room and the dancing room and looked at her with the expression that had become, over 5 weeks, entirely familiar to her. And then he turned to include the room in what he said next. "Miss Crane." The voice was level and carried without being raised. "I would like you to stand up with me for the next set." A pause that lasted 1 breath. "And I would like to speak with you afterward, about the matter we discussed at Ashton Grange. I am in no confusion about my obligations, nor about what I want." Lady Sefton's fan stopped its motion. The room's attention was of the particular quality that requires no description. Dorothea felt it settle over her, the collective recalibration, the social world briefly suspending its own machinery to register a new arrangement and find it legitimate. Mrs. Burroughs' expression had shifted entirely. The Reverend Calthwaite's wife had turned toward her husband with the smallest possible smile. 2 of the young women from the milliners were present, and their faces were doing something complicated and warm. Dorothea placed her hand on his arm. "I would like that," she said. They danced. She was aware of him in a way she had not permitted herself to be in public before. The measured weight of his hand, the warm pressure of proximity through 2 layers of evening dress, the fact that he moved with an economy she had come to understand as discipline rather than indifference. And in the turn of the last figure of the set, when the pattern brought them close, and the candlelight was full and warm, and the fiddles were in the upper register, he said, at a volume meant for her alone, "I meant what I said." "I know," she said. "I want," he said in the same voice with the same careful weight, "to do this correctly. Not because it is required, because you deserve it done correctly." The warmth that moved through her then had nothing to do with the dancing. They were married quietly in the village church where her father was buried on the 20th of December, in weather that offered a thin cold sunlight through clouds that were not quite deciding to snow. The Reverend Calthwaite officiated. Mrs. Totten sat in the front pew in her best coat, and was the only person in the church who wept, which she did without audible noise, and with perfect dignity. A handful of tenants from the Ashton Grange farm stood at the churchyard wall in the cold because they had come of their own accord, and it had not occurred to anyone to tell them not to. Edmund held her hand at the church threshold afterward, in the gray December light, with the same weight he had first held it in the drawing room. She stood in the cold in her good gown, with the snow that had finally decided on itself beginning to fall in small, careful flakes, and felt, without sentimentality, that the machinery of the past year had been leading here, and that here was not what she had planned for, and was better than what she had planned for, and that the difference was him. Westerby Park was larger than she had imagined, and some of its rooms were colder than she expected, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Grayston, was not Mrs. Totten, but was a woman of considerable competence who had assessed Dorothea's capacity for managing an estate in approximately the first 3 days, and had thereafter conducted herself with the particular efficiency of a woman who has found an employer worth working for. Dorothea had read the Park's account books before moving in. She had told Edmund she had done so. He had looked at her with the expression that was his closest equivalent to laughter. "Of course you did," he said. "There is an error in the Southern Field drainage records," she said, "going back 4 years. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They sat at the desk in his study and went through the records together. And it was, she thought, a very good way to begin. She had her own room at Westerby Park, which was not a sitting room in the conventional arrangement, but a study with north light and a view of the kitchen garden, because she had asked for a room for working, and he had given her one without question. She had moved her father's writing case to the desk. She had moved her mother's portrait to the wall above it, and on the morning she hung it, she stood in the cold room with the portrait in her hands, and felt the particular grief that comes not when things are lost, but when they are finally, properly safe. She heard his step in the corridor, which she knew by now, the particular measured weight of it. He came to the study doorway and stood there as he had stood in the drawing-room doorway at Ashton Grange, watching. "My mother," she said before he could ask. "I have been carrying it from house to house for 11 months. She hung it above the desk and stepped back. The frame was a little worn at the corner, and the light in the portrait was soft and old, and her mother looked out of it with the particular composed expression that Dorothea had been attempting to replicate for most of her adult life. Edmund crossed the room and stood beside her, and they looked at it together for a moment, in the cold north light. "It belongs here now," he said. She did not answer, because there was nothing to add to it. She turned slightly toward him, and he put his arm around her, without ceremony, and they stood in the cold study with the kitchen garden visible through the window, and the snow that was beginning again on the glass, and the portrait of her mother on the wall. And she felt, in the particular stillness of it, that the question she had asked in October, the question about his name on paper, had been the right question. She had asked for a reasonable thing. It had turned out to be the start of everything. The frost lay white on the garden outside. The fire she had just had lit was beginning to catch properly, the smell of the wood and the warmth spreading toward the window. Dorothea Carver, Marchioness of Ashford, stood in her study with her husband beside her and her mother on the wall, and the account books of the southern field on the desk. And the snow came down quiet and steady outside the north window. And it was exactly as much as she had needed, and exactly as much as she had earned. And it was, at last, hers.